Hi there guys, and welcome to another episode of the Cover Zero Show with me, your host Simon Conboy. Carrying on with the QB Quandaries series today, this episode will be focusing on the Cleveland Browns. So for those of you who haven't seen one of these episodes before, I'll be discussing the ongoing quest to find a franchise quarterback for concerned team, breaking down the guys that are currently on the roster, where they may stand in this regime's current planning, and how things may look going forward, possibly looking ahead to future drafts, free agency, and the like. So the Browns currently, fortunately, Hugh Jackson has shed a little bit of light on this, whether it ends up being relevant at the start of the season, we'll see. States that it's Cody Kessler's job at this point in time, and it's down to the other guys to overthrow him. Kessler, I thought, played admirably last year. Took an absolute shoeing behind what was a very poor offensive line. They've revamped that, so in theory that shouldn't necessarily be an issue. A lot of inexperience at wide receiver, breaking in Corey Coleman. Terrell Pryor, whilst he was very effective, isn't a particularly experienced NFL receiver. Generally it was an atrocious team. I thought he had acquitted himself pretty well in the games that he did play. Not sure the skill set is there to be a guy that you'd want to hang your hat on and say, right, this is our guy for the long-term future. Showed, the fragility that those injuries would concern me, even though he did take a beating in terms of his ability to start 16 games year in and year out. I don't think he's got the arm strength to be an absolute top-end quarterback. You can get there without it, but I think he'd need the pieces around him. He's not going to be a guy that's going to beat you by himself and necessarily elevate his teammates to the level required to win 10 plus games every season. So I really see his upside as being a high-end backup in this league or a low-end starter. I understand going with him. He's got some experience in the system, and as I say, I feel he played reasonably last year for a third-round rookie. Other guys on the roster at the minute, Brock Osweiler, I don't think he's got a shot at this job. I think what we saw last year in Houston on a pretty talented team, it is basically doomed his career. I can't imagine a team giving him a shot at earning a job again. He would have to be absolutely lights out during training camp and preseason. From what we saw last year, he looked confused, didn't process information quickly enough, took bad sacks, made some horrible decisions, was an absolute turnover machine. And Texans have a far superior roster to what the Browns have. So I can't see Brock Osweiler being trotted out barring injuries. He may start as the backup to Kessler. Of course, they drafted in Deshaun Kaiser in round 2. I believe he is probably the closest to being able to start in the NFL of the bunch of rookies that were drafted this year. I think he looks like a pro quarterback. I think he's got the arm. It's just whether he can do it consistently. Notre Dame, I don't think he played to his talent level. Made a lot of bad decisions. Bit too much confidence in his own arm. I think he can certainly be developed, and Hugh Jackson is good at that. Whether the physical tools are there, if they can get him on the right track, I do think he could be a future starter for them. However, I'm not sure he's necessarily being looked at that way. If that was the case, I do think they would have selected him with one of the 2 first-round picks they ended up using on Jabril Peppers and David Njoku, respectively. So I think the Kaiser is essentially a stopgap. If they see something from him, then I don't think they'll be afraid to pull the trigger on rolling with him, possibly giving him an audition for the job. There is a chance I think we see him towards the end of the season, because I do think this team will struggle. I do think rolling him out as a day one start would be a disaster, but I certainly think if the season is going poorly, which it likely will be, he will absolutely be worth checking out for the last maybe 6 or 7 games of the season, see what kind of progression's been made, and if any of that physical talent can translate early and earn him a shot at the job for the long term. However, not sure that happens. I think next year is where the Browns have their eye at this point in time. I think that if Kirk Cousins, which by the way, I do not think he's going to leave Washington next season. At this point, it seems like everything's sort of been resolved there. I do think they'll get a long-term extension done. If he was to become available, I'm pretty sure the Browns would be players in terms of looking to acquire him. The Niners may seem the more desirable spot for Cousins because of his experience with Kyle Shanahan, and there's certainly a mutual interest from the 49ers organisation there of that. I've got no doubt. But I certainly think the Browns would be a pretty reasonable landing spot. The offensive line there looks good. They've still got a lot of picks in next year's draft to maybe try and find some weapons that he can develop with. And they look more like a team closer to starting to ascend than the 49ers do at this point. I certainly feel they're a year or two behind in the full rebuild mode that both of these franchises have gone through as of late. So I certainly think he'll be an option. Jimmy Garoppolo, I think the fact that he wasn't traded this off-season, his stock isn't going to be any higher than it is at this point. It really does show the Patriots are serious when they say that they see Garoppolo as Brady's replacement. If Brady ends up playing on for another 2 or 3 years, then I think there will be a question as to whether Garoppolo goes elsewhere simply to get playing time. But I would have to think next off-season is unlikely to be a time where Garoppolo is going to be acquired unless the player really starts demanding the opportunity to play elsewhere. If so, again, I think they'll certainly be interested, and I do think he would be seen as a more desirable target than one of the quarterbacks in next year's draft. So I don't see either of those happening. Either I think Kaiser shows enough this year that they're content to roll with him. However, I wouldn't be shocked if, even if that is the case, they still roll with a quarterback next year. Now, of course, we do still have a full college season to go, so I don't want to, go too far into, saying I advocate these guys being number one picks or of that talent level. I do think Sam Darnold is talented enough to be picked in the top 5 as a QB, having watched quite a lot of his USC tape over the last few weeks. He looks like a commanding presence, maybe a little too overconfident in his arm at times, but he can throw well on the move, has a good arm, maybe not quite, it's not a Matthew Stafford level rocket arm, but he's got a good arm, decent size, and certainly the mobility that I think you look for in a modern quarterback, particularly in a Hugh Jackson-led scheme. I think he'd be a great fit for them, and I think he'd certainly be a long-term option if they are in a position to draft him and still deem quarterback to be that significant a need. You've got Josh Rosen from UCLA, not as much tape on him, better arm than Darnold. Knee injury would concern me. We'll see what he shows this year, but it seems like he's going to be projected to be quite high. And then you've got Josh Allen, the kid from Wyoming. I'm a little bit iffy on him. His throwing motion isn't the best. He's a bit inaccurate. Can certainly sling it large distances, and is a much better athlete than he appears. He's very lanky, lean, kind of 6'5" quarterback. Looks a bit clumsy running, but can certainly do so. He's clearly got a great arm. Far too many interceptions. Plays with that gunslinger type mentality like Patrick Mahomes did. So I think he's certainly got a lot of work, but I think his arm and his size will, if he has a good college season, lead to him being drafted in the top half of round 1. So I think all 3 of those would be potential options for the franchise if they do still have questions heading into the 2018 season. I think it's quite likely that they do. If Kaiser comes good, then that's a wonderful thing for this franchise. I don't think they're relying on that being the case. They do have 2 first-round picks next year and 2 second-rounders still, so they've got plenty of ammunition to trade for, whether it's a veteran that can come in and help them right away who becomes available, or if they do need to move up in the draft to a premium spot. They're certainly a team with the ammunition to do so. So there's numerous options, but just to wrap up, I believe this team is going to be looking for its answer next year. I think Cody Kessler will get the start. I think we'll see enough out of him to see that his ceiling is not particularly high. He may do a reasonable job. I think they'll look at Kaiser midway through the season when the record is likely to be not very good. Of course, assuming what he would do is a projection. I think on a bad team, I think it could look poor. I think he'll warrant another look in next season, but they may decide to pull the trigger, and I think they likely will decide to pull the trigger on one of the higher touted quarterbacks that are coming out next season. I do think they'll be drafting high again. Whilst I like what they've done, I still see this as a team that's going to be picking in the top 10 with its own pick. If the Texans do really badly, then that'll be an added boon for them, of course, with their first rounder next year. We'll see. That depends on another rookie quarterback, Deshaun Watson. But there you have it. That's the Browns QB quandary. I think perfect scenario, they can somehow get Jimmy Garoppolo. I just can't see that happening at this point in time. So look for them to get their franchise QB next year for me, or their projected franchise QB next year. Expect this year to be just them, looking for upside and not finding it. So there you have it. That's my thoughts on the Browns. Still a lot of work to be done with this franchise. However, I do think this off-season can give you guys some hope that they might be competing in 2018 and beyond. So, hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think. Got the comment section below. Cover Zero on Facebook. Find me on Twitter at Simon Conboy. I'll be more than happy to respond to each and every one of you. It's always cool when people do. Come back tomorrow. Got a Cover Who episode coming up. Done some off-season reviews, draft reviews, free agency reviews, all that kind of stuff up on the channel. So if you've enjoyed this, check those out. Plenty more stuff coming up. Check out Friday. We'll be revealing some of the top 10 players at the defensive end position, pass rushers in the NFL. I think that should be a good list, as well as my weekly roundup. Check that out. As always, like, share, subscribe. Check out the Patreon if you've enjoyed the show. It'd be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure as always, and go Bucks.